Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you join us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations, where we have a slightly shorter program for you today and a much more trimmed down team as usual. The reason why it's a shorter program today is multifold. One of the reasons, of course, is that we only have half the team with us. The other reason is that we've got a very busy day ahead in Australia for both John and Craig, who are, of course, in the same room together. We'll get them to comment on that in a moment. But I've also had a very busy day here, and we'll be back on the road again tomorrow as we travel around the UK on our last ever ministry trip before Christmas. So we're just going to do a slightly trimmed down, slightly shorter version, but we're going to stick to the topic in question. Now, Craig, you're obviously in the same room as John, so you're up in the Brisbane area to get involved with the museum, I believe.
Yeah, so we've got the open day today and looking forward to that. There's a big group coming along, and just took this opportunity to come up and give John a hand and get involved.
Yep, we have an absolutely packed house, so nobody else turn up, please. We're already wonderfully overcrowded, and we'll be taking them through the evidence for creation, Noah's flood, whole heap of interesting things, because none of these people, as far as I know, have ever been to this museum before. So great new opportunity today at the Creation Discovery Centre here in Queensland.
Great stuff, great stuff. Well, our main topic tonight that we're going to be discussing between us is, excuse me, a variety of things regarding Tower of Babel. Craig's got a section about people movement. John's got a great section that I'll be joining in with about Boomerangs language and language groups and the like as well. And we'll probably bring in a little bit of the Stone Age as well, but we're aiming to be a little bit shorter than usual, probably only somewhere around about an hour. And the other thing we do, we normally, as you know, a new feature of Creation Conversations has been the headlines that we do every week, but we're going to do a slightly trimmed down version of the headlines this week, and just mention a couple of things and get perhaps John and Craig to comment on them as we go. But a couple of significant things that have cropped up. The first one is the fact that earlier on today in the UK, there was a rather historic bill passed through Parliament. Now, it's not law yet. It's got to go through a few other avenues. Not that I think that that's going to make that much difference, but it's an issue which has already been accepted in Canada, already been accepted in the Netherlands. I believe it's being accepted, if it hasn't already been accepted, in Australia, but I think that's a fairly recent thing. But it's to do with this assisted dying. Now, I started watching some of the debate in Parliament a little bit earlier. I had to turn it off because it got so frustrating, especially as one of the main members of Parliament opposed to the assisted dying bill got rather severely told off by both another member of Parliament and by the Speaker of the House for using the word suicide. Now, they said that was offensive to call this bill anything to do with suicide, because it wasn't anything to do with suicide. It was to do with assisted dying or the voluntary taking of your life. Now, he apologized for offending people if he was offended, but he said, I'm afraid I'm going to have to refer to it as suicide because that's the only way we can place the suicide bill. John, maybe you'd like to comment a little bit on what is a biblical perspective around this. Really down.
There's always a statement you can come back to. God is the giver of life, and he forbids any of us. Have a look at his rules given through Moses about murder, and his rules if you actually accidentally kill someone. So he obviously regards life as incredibly precious, and he regards himself as the only one who has the right to give it and to take it, right? Except for punishment, when God does implement capital punishment for murder and things like that. So you find that there's some quite strict rules from Genesis onwards, in Genesis chapter 8, 9, and 10, when Noah is told from now on, if a man kills another man, his life must be taken by man. But that's God's rule, not Noah's. Most of us wouldn't like to do that, but in reality, God gave us a rule, and you find two things happening. When society forbids you to put to death someone who's really deserved, and is actually willing to allow people to be assisted to die when they haven't done anything wrong, except to perhaps be sick, but that's not doing anything wrong. You're seeing worse. And I come back to the biblical teaching where God tells us those who hate me love death, right? And there's a good connection there because the Bible talks about the wages of sin is death. So if you love death, it's because you are entrenched in your affection to sin. So that's the biggest picture you can probably get to that. So can I encourage you, many of you with older relatives will find yourselves being pressured, particularly in hospital wards that are overcrowded. You know, you could assist the person, be kind to them, put them to death. Really, they mean we need the bed, right? So it's sort of a tragic situation if it goes through in England. And yes, it's being pushed all through the West, particularly in countries that used to have a strong Christian stand. And bit by bit, piece by piece, politicians have whittled away, scientists have whittled away, claiming that life has evolved, therefore there is no God, therefore there is no sin, therefore we must make the rules. And this is just kind. Well, I love to warn people, if you're willing to help somebody to die, remember, if they're not saved, then hell is a far worse option than staying in a sick bed with lots of pain.
Yeah, and we made this point a few weeks back when this bill was first being pushed through really quickly, and the decision was made with with under less than 6 hours of debating, even within the House of Commons. But we made the point that the Bible's description of murder is clear, and also statement against murder is clear. Right, your life is not to take; it's not your decision. It's God's decision. And even Job, when he got to the point of being, wishing death upon himself, and had everything taken from him and had been tortured by Satan, with God's permission, by the way. That's the other point in Job, right? It was all done with God's permission. Even Job had to say, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Right, it's God. Your life is God's to deal with, and not your own. So we have to make sure that we have a biblical perspective of all of this as we go forward. The other point, the little headline that I just wanted to sort of bring up, which is something that we had a good laugh about this week, and I shared it around some of the team. But I'll just pull it up here. It's actually a link to a newspaper article. Hopefully, you can see that there. Does that come up for you, John? Can you see that?
That's there.
That's there. Good. All right. Daily Mail. So it's a moderately legitimate newspaper in the UK. But have a look at the headline there. Geology is racist as it is linked to white supremacy, claims Queen Mary University of London professor. There she is there. Anyway, we'll move on from that. A geography professor at a leading British university has described the study of rocks and the natural world as racist and linked the academic field to white supremacy. They said that geology was, as a subject, was riven by systematic racism and influenced heavily by colonialism. The study of prehistoric life through fossils was also branded as an enabler for racism, with the professor referring to the field of paleontology as pale ontology. Anyway, two things that I just popped to mind other than immediate laughter, John, is number one, at least there is a recognition that geology and paleontology is heavily linked to, because that was a point that Professor Derek Ager made, which was effectively that the geological column was a baby of the British Empire, and if the geological column had been developed in China, it would look very, very different. So there is some good to be made of recognizing this, but what do you make of this claim that geology is racist?
Okay, in Australia here, traditionally the universities have had a Christian basis, so that over my science department entrance, there was a statement that said, "Let there be light." Now, even me from a non-Christian background knew one thing, that was a statement out of the book of Genesis. And when you look through the history of geology, it begins with Christianized attitudes after the Reformation of people recognizing one God, one set of rules. Therefore, if God invented it, everything must make sense. So instead of having the Greek philosophy that the fossils were just random tricks played by the gods, they started arguing if it looks like a shark's teeth, it is a shark's teeth. And you can see many of our programs on the history of geology. So when you look at that and you ask, where did this most affect things? Now, not wishing to be anti-Catholic or anything, the majority of the progress in this field was made by those who had gone with the Reformation. So you look at people and they began to come out of the Middle Age view that our mind could be still Greek, but our body and our soul could be saved. And they started to say our whole mind must be Christianized. So hence the logic, if it looks like a shark's teeth, it's probably a shark's teeth. It's there to make sense because God made everything, including the sharks, right? And it's there to glorify him. Now, from there, when you look at the expansion of things, there is an undeniable link between people who wanted to go around the world and explore, people who wanted to go around the world and explore and find metals, people who wanted to go around the world, explore, find metals, and get rich and bring it all back to London. Right, so there is a part of a truth in this, but in mapping where the metals and all the gold and the fossils were, Derek Age's point is a valid one. If they started digging all this stuff up in China, which, by the way, most of you may not know was a closed society to much of our trading for a long time, then you would have ended up with a totally different geologic column. Now, he was never popular for saying that, and this professor here is probably unpopular too amongst the geologists because they like to think of themselves as objective. But they are so overlaid by history here, and that history started out with a Christian worldview, but now it's progressed to an anti-Christian worldview. And she may be woke, but she's still fast asleep. But she can recognize some things. This progression is anti-Christian. She's probably happy with that, but it still is linked to the British Empire, but not in the way she's trying to make out as it being racist. Racism had nothing to do with people recognizing shark fossils. It may have had something to do with what they spent their money on in buying slaves or shipping them to America or anything, but they're two unrelated ideas. Joe, back to you. And by the way, is it cold over in England?
It is a little bit cold over in England. I could do with some more global warming over here for sure, put it that way. But yeah, so I mean,
You need
sometimes
to burn more of that black rock.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Impose some of
Well,
our
that's
colonial
great.
duties onto the world. Sometimes with some stuff that comes out, you just can't do anything other than just look and laugh, to be perfectly honest with you. It just get very, very ridiculous very, very quickly, especially. And I think a lot of this seems to come from when you, let's stop sharing that for a second, when you reject the authority of Christ, particularly the authority that we were given by God, which is that of dominion over the world, right, and dominion over the planet. We do seem to be in a world today that likes to revoke us of our dominion that God has given us and to play God where we have not been given permission to play. Right? We've got examples of both of that in the two things that we've discussed so far tonight. Right? We have one geology professor telling us that we ought to revoke our God-given right as dominion over the earth by getting rid of geology because it's racist. And you see that with the climate change philosophy as well. And then on the other hand, we've got people who are wanting to vote where we don't have a right to be playing around with, which is what is effectively the taking of one's life, right? Suicide, assisted murder, whatever you want to call it. So we really are in a topsy-turvy world where once you've rejected the truth, you can really accept any kind of lie or philosophy that you want. So we continue to remind people that you need to get back to the scriptures. We continue to encourage people to stand firm on the word of God. Speaking of racism, it's mildly linked to our topic tonight, which is the origin of races, people spreading out over the planet, out of the Tower of Babel. And in fact, I did a Tower of Babel program for the homeschool group that we did today was one of your old programs, John, the Q&A, Tower of Babel Q&A. And I realized that the last time I'd done that program for a homeschool group, it was at a primitive Baptist church in the USA, and everything was in King James version. So I had to go rushing through trying to change up some of the words so that kids could understand it. But anyway, all fun. Why don't we go over to Craig first for his section, which is a point about people movement, particularly in Tasmania, I believe. And then we will go over to you, John, for your section on boomerangs and language and the like, and I'll pick up the pieces towards the end. So get your questions in, folks. We'll try and have a few questions answered tonight if we can, even though it's a bit of a shorter program tonight. We will certainly get to some questions. But if I can just jump in quickly while you're getting your slides up, Craig, we do have a couple of thank yous, which I'm going to just deal with now very quickly. We have one from Fiorella. Thank you very much. We have one from Doki Doki. Thank you very much. And I believe I'm right in saying that this is the first time you've done it. I think that's what you meant earlier. Little old me, when you said you'd managed to get it to work. So thank you very much. We greatly appreciate it. And I'm afraid I'm not going to do a Sam and try and act out all of the comments, but there we go. Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. I just really wanted to expand a little bit more on creation headlines that I used last week about the Tasmanian Aboriginals coming and how they would get here, because a lot of people have problems with the time frames that are expressed in the Bible. If the flood was about 2350 BC, we get a lot of ancient history reports that talk about people, living in what we would regard as the post-flood world with 3, 4, 5,000 BC and so on. So I just wanted to start here in Genesis 14, where the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim and Bela, as you can see there on that slide, went to battle with 4 other kings: Chedorlaomer, a king of Elam; Tidal, king of nations; Amphraphel, king of Shinar; and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. And there's this passage of where these kings attack. And by the way, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. Elam is a grandson of Noah and really one of Abraham's relatives. They're both descendants of Shem. But anyway, these various tribal groups had started to expand, and they'd come over and attacked, and they'd grabbed Lot and other people from Sodom, and Abraham took off. So let's jump down to verse 14. And is that changed for you, Joe?
Joe?
You there, Joe?
Yep, that's changed. Yep, you're good.
Yeah, it's clicking through, yeah. Okay, so now when Abraham heard that his brother, that's Lot, was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. Now, the point of raising this is that Abraham took on 4 kings, and they'd already attacked and defeated 5 kings. So we would imagine that's a reasonable size army. Well, that's what immediately comes up in our minds. But just look at how many people Abraham went and attacked them with, 318. And that's not a huge army. So what sort of army was it that attacked in the initial instance from the 4 kings? And I suspect it wasn't tens of thousands of people. It may have been a few thousand. There may have been some miraculous intervention by God there, as it says that Melchizedek says to Abraham, God has handed them over to you. But nevertheless, we're not talking about huge armies like we see some centuries later. So that's just to set a context about the size of populations at that time. And I've got a bit of a timeline here, biblical timeline. So the flood was around 2350 BC. Babel is approximately 100 years later. and then you've got the growing of the tribal groups. Abraham then moved to the land of Canaan, which is another grandson of Noah, and he lived approximately in that time frame there. Some people might move it slightly one way or the other, but that is the approximate time that he was living. Now, I'll give that relevance to the Tasmanian Aboriginals and the time that it took for them to get right down to Tasmania, one of the far reaches of the world, from Babel. Now, I did a rough calculation of time and distance. It's about 22,000 kilometres, maybe slightly less if you went in a straight line, but about 22,000 kilometres. It sounds like a long distance for someone to walk. We don't know that they walked only, because there was boat building capacity back in those days. There may have been some across ocean transit as well. But that's basically where they needed to get to. Here's Tasmania. Now you can see King and Flinders Island. There's basically a ridge that goes up through the Furneaux group, which is Flinders Island group, up through that smattering of islands you can see up into the southern part of Victoria. Now, the depth of Bass Strait, and you can see just by looking at the broader shot there that Bass Strait has a land bridge. And now, during the Ice Age, which we've spoken of a number of times on Creation Conversations, with all the water being locked up in ice across the world, then the oceans must have dropped. And this is widely accepted in both non-Christian circles and Christian circles, creation circles, that the oceans may have dropped as much as 150 metres. Well, Bass Strait is only as deep as 40 to 50 metres in some places, especially along those ridge lines there that have now been inundated. So there's no problems at all during the Ice Age for people to walk across to Tasmania. And these are the sort of paths that they could take even probably quite late into the Ice Age. So when did the Ice Age occur? Well, let's have a look at that. 22,000 kilometres on foot. If you averaged 100 kilometres per year, it would take you about 220 years. And so the Aboriginals would arrive in about the time of Abraham if they moved at about that rate. And by the way, that's only less than 3 kilometres per day. And they are a nomadic group. They walk all the time. Even in the modern era, they still like to get about. So that's quite doable, and that's not even counting potential ship transport across. So even if they walked, it would take them 220 years probably as a minimum. But there's the Ice Age. So the Ice Age models that creationists propose is roughly about 50 years after the flood. It may have been 100 years. Needed to get enough momentum to build up to the size it got. And so the models predict approximately 700 years, and that's the span that it takes. Therefore, the Aboriginals had to most likely turn up while the land bridge was available in this period. And at the end of the Ice Age, Bass Strait, there may have been some delays as the lowest bits, the exposed bits of land, the highest bits, I should have said, maintained access all the way along. So across Bass Strait, but approximately 1600 BC. So the Aboriginals had to get to Tasmania roughly in this time, and they were cut off. This is an example of a Tasmanian Aboriginal craft. There's no way you get across Bass Strait. In fact, a number of years ago in the very famous Sydney to Hobart yacht race, there was a number of people killed. The oceans were that rough in modern sailing boats. So there's no way you get one of these things across Bass Strait, even island hopping. So they were cut off. But when white people or Europeans eventually got to Tasmania in about 1803, the settlement was set up. There was only an estimated 4,000 to 15,000 Aboriginals. So Britannica Online says as few as 4,000. The secular estimates of when Aboriginals got to Tasmania is about 35,000 years. So that means their population, even with disease and war and difficulties in the climate, their population should have been way, way bigger than that if they'd been here this long. But when you take the size of the population around Abraham's time and the number of people that he got together to take on the four kings, it's suggesting that the population sizes were huge. So that suggests that the number of Aboriginals that made it to Tasmania wasn't huge. And so therefore we can expect maybe as the ocean started to rise, some of them started to take off back north even. And the last ones were trapped there, and they're the ones that bred up, and their descendants were there when the Europeans arrived. So that's it for me. Joe, if you'd like to come back to us.
That's fine. Yeah, let me just pull that over. There we go. All right.
All right, I'll just make a comment here. Now, some of you who know me know that I'm sort of 6'4" on the old scale, dropping down to 6'3" as I age. And what's interesting, of course, is I've always been a walker. So 20 to 30 kilometres a day is not difficult for a man that has got long legs like me. Now, my poor wife, who on the old scale is only 5'2" and eyes are blue, she would never be able to keep up with me. So it depends on the size of these people, how far they can walk. But the distance that Craig talked about at 100 kilometres per year is insignificant, right? It just simply is easy to do, particularly when you realise that after the flood, all of the jungles, all of the absolutely cluttered forests are gone. It all starts again. And I'm always reminded of the man who, I don't know whether he set out to prove something, but he wheelchaired all the way through China to raise funds for incapacitated people. And he didn't take ages to get from one end of the world to the other because he was using roads, obviously, and things like that. But that's what the post-flood world would have been like. And then the ice would have made it even clearer because the rate of growth of things is much slower in the cold. But there's one thing that I thought of that is not usually discussed here. We've mentioned Abraham. We've mentioned when he was there. We've mentioned the number of people. One question that most people never ask is, did Tasmanian Aboriginals circumcise? I know it's a non-discussion issue because it's regarded as, not healthy to do today, but in reality, they did, right? And if you look at circumcision, it's a right which God gave to Abraham. I won't discuss the details for those of you who are fascinated, look it up. But in reality, you'll find that it would seem that this process spread. So therefore, you've got another indicator, the fact that most Aboriginal groups circumcise their boys, some at birth, some, when they're going into manhood, like many groups around the planet, would indicate that this was simply something after Abraham. And so the point that Craig was making is a vital one. If they truly been here, vast ages, as popular with the secular, then their rate of reproduction was dismal. I mean, 4,000 people, as in Britannica Online says. I mean, if you're going to take 35,000 years to end up with 4,000 people, then you just don't have it. It's simply a failure rate. And even if you allow 30,000 years, it's still even worse. So when you have a look at all of this, the indication is that the Aborigines have not been there for a vast period of time. And of course, Craig, I believe they used burning down there to open up the grasslands for hunting. Is that what they did?
Yeah, they did. And one of the other points that it's worthwhile making is with the arrow going across northern Australia through to southern Australia before you get to Tasmania, well, that's all desert now. But it's most likely that during the Ice Age that was quite lush, and that some of the huge megafauna that lived in Australia really blossomed in those areas even in that time. So there's a lot of evidence that there was lush vegetation. They could have walked straight through that area, and it's dried since those times.
Yeah, we even saw this as a cycle in our modern habitation of Australia by Europeans, because when they first ventured into South Australia, it was green, basically all the way up to what used to be called Ayers Rock. And then they settled up there, up to the almost the border of South Australia and the Northern Territory. And then all of a sudden, they realised it hadn't rained for 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, and they had to withdraw. So if you travel from Adelaide up towards the centre, you'll find a progression of houses that have been abandoned. And the interesting thing is, the last time I was out there, it was green again, right? So you have a look, we have a cycle, then 150 years or so goes past, then it's green again. So what Craig is suggesting is not so unrealistic at all. If you had good years after the flood, before the weather falls apart with the ice, then you could easily walk across the centre, particularly if there's no forest or no desert or anything like that. And we've got all the evidence from the billabongs and the lakes out there. The interesting thing is they're usually surrounded, where the water has stayed, by jungle type plants, right? Palm trees and things like that. So these are not plants which are spread by birds. They were there in the beginning, and then around it has died off. So there's plenty of evidence that they could have walked across the centre. And it even shows in the art, doesn't it? The art of South Australia and the art of Tasmanian Aborigines, you can see the link, and then it's been cut off. So what did they use burning for in Tasmania?
Oh, clear the vegetation so they could walk and get around.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound terribly political, but one of the reasons we have many grasslands in Australia is because you can't throw a boomerang in a forest, right? And hunting with a spear is tough as well, so you burn it all down. So keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out who looks after the environment.
And the open country would have been really good for creatures like the thylacine, Tasmanian tiger. They just can't get through thick scrub. When we did our West Coast wilderness walk a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago now, it was so incredibly dense. It was in an area in the wilderness, southwest wilderness of Tassie. But when the early European settlers had a convict settlement, one of the most remote places in the world for a penal settlement, Sarah Island, on the west coast of Tassie, the settlers there used to report how they would see the Aboriginals, or they called them the blacks. I'm not trying to be racist, but they called them the blacks, would be burning. And it appeared as though the whole land was alight. That's the way they reported their early observations of what the Aboriginals were doing with fire. And so it was regularly burnt. But that very area we walked in, we struggled. It was very, very dense. And it hasn't been burnt regularly since the demise of the Aboriginal burning practices, and it's all come back.
Yes, you even see, if you bother to get Captain Cook's diaries, you'll find that he reports the whole land is on fire at certain times, and it seems most likely that's what the Aborigines are doing, burning off the forest so they could hunt and do quite well.
So the point we're really trying to get to with this discussion is that there was time for the Aboriginals to get here at the, when the land bridge between Australia and Tasmania was in place. And the secular dating is completely dependent on things like a cave, an Aboriginal cave dwelling that they found in the southwest of Tasmania, and the way they apply all the assumptions of their dating methods, perhaps with some stone tools or whatever there, a bit of the art, I'm not sure, but there's so much guesswork involved in that. And I guess what we're saying is that they've completely got it wrong.
Okay, can I just ask you a couple of questions before I take over, Craig? Now, you can throw a boomerang in grassland, correct? Yep. And it works well. You can burn down the forest so you can throw your boomerang, and that obviously would work. You've mentioned Abraham. Now, Abraham's not 40,000 years ago. He's after Noah's flood, correct? Mm-hmm. I've mentioned circumcision, which is a right the Bible says God gave to Abraham to identify his descendants as belonging to God only. Is that you or me? Anyway, and so we've got a biblical perspective with Abraham, and then the spreading after the Tower of Babel, which is the first hint that there would end up people in Australia. So at Babel, you have Abraham descending, you have the Aborigines descending, you have the Chinese going where they're going, and we talk about those on various programs. Now, keep all that in mind as we think through how do we join the dots, because at Babel, they're all there. at Babel, there are the dark-skinned people, there are the light-skinned people, there are the people in between, there are those who will end up with what we call almond eyes, those who end up with oval eyes, and they're all there together. And then they separate out, and you end up with cultures such as Egypt, you end up with cultures such as Aboriginals, and they all started in the same place. Now, one of the things that Joe and I have done a lot of research on is what else have they got in common. So, Joe, if you'll put me up, or Craig, if you'll press the right buttons here. I like having Craig here. I don't have to remember what it is. Yes, Joe?
That's fine. I'll pull it up for you in just a sec. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, so notice the heading from Boomerangs to Babel. It would have been regarded as a bizarre heading when I grew up because boomerangs were regarded as exclusively the property of Australian Aborigines. But some people have asked questions about giants in the land. And so initially, Joe and I did a lot of work on giants, and I'd recommend you go to our programs and hunt down giants and see what the biblical view is. But I decided one day to go and see what the Egyptian word for giants was. So I looked up G, found GA, and you see that funny looking crown thing in the middle. You see a bird on the right-hand side middle, and then you see a bent stick. Well, looking up all of the books that we needed to hunt, this one here looks like a boomerang on the right-hand side. So when you have a look, what are you doing, Craig? Oh, right, okay. Joe and I talked about this, and because he's doing his PhD, he has access to all sorts of interesting books. So we looked up this one here, Wallace Budge Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary. Now, this is not your overnight reading to send you awake. It will certainly send you to sleep. But put it in context with the fact that Egypt is post-Babel. Egypt is post-Noah. Egypt is mentioned in the Bible quite a few times because Moses is there. And in the New Testament, Moses gets a mention here. At this time, Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God. And this whole chapter is on how God has used the whole history of the world to bring people to his attention, or bring him to people's attention. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son in the palaces of the Egyptians. And it finishes there. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in word and deed. So the one thing the New Testament is emphatic about Moses is he was raised, educated, wealthy. He was brought up knowing all the Egyptian stuff, including hieroglyphics. Okay, where do boomerangs fit into this? Well, when you looked at the books, it advised us that funny shape up there. Well, you go and learn your ABCs. Where do these shapes come from? ABC in English, Greek, alpha, beta, gamma. In the Paleo-Hebrew, one that's been preserved a bit north of Jerusalem today, you find it there, Aleph, Bet, and Gimel. Now, traditionally, they thought of Gimel must be from the shape of a camel's head, but you watch. Put it there, put some symbols in, A, B, and C. Well, there's some connection with the Greek, alpha, beta, gamma, and Paleo-Hebrew. You can even, well, look, there's that bent stick over on the right-hand side associated with Gimel, with a, just a bracket around the other side. Now, what's the connection here? There's a connection. Of course, you read Greek from left to right. You read Hebrew from right to left. What an amazing coincidence that the letter for G in Egyptian, or Paleo-Hebrew rather, is related but reversed to the letter in Greek. Now, where do all these things come from? Yes, it's becoming increasingly unpopular to attribute the alphabet to Egyptians, but you watch what you've got. There's no doubt about it. English people have borrowed from the Greeks and from the Romans, and a bit from the Arabic as well. The Greek people have definitely borrowed from the Hebrews. And the Paleo-Hebrew, did they have it originally? Or did they get it because Moses was learned? You see, the rest of the people probably weren't learned because they were just slaves. But Moses was head and shoulder above the rest in education. He had a very wealthy education, both in Hebrew, from his mum and dad, and occasionally from stuff his sister slipped to him, but he also had it in Egyptian. The connection, ancient Egyptians, yes, there's Tutankhamun's famous sculpture out of his grave stuff. There's again a reminder about Moses. At this time Moses was born, we've had that before, and the last verse, Moses grew up learning all the wisdom of the Egyptian, and he was mighty in words and deed. And most people don't really understand how wealthy he was or how well known he was. Think carefully. He kills an Egyptian for mistreating an Israelite. He's in trouble now because not even a prince can get away, particularly a Jewish prince, can get away with killing an Egyptian. So he flees into the desert for years and years and years, and then God calls him to come back. And when Moses comes back, he just goes straight up to Pharaoh's house, and they all recognize him, and it's the prince, Moses, Prince of Egypt. They let him in. I mean, you and I couldn't walk up to the palace and say, I want to talk to King Charles. It wouldn't work. It did for Moses. Moses was trained by the Egyptians. He learned the Egyptian language and writing. He was a prince of Egypt, even influential after 40 years. He knew all about Egyptian pictorial writing and symbolic meaning. And the sounds, surprisingly to us, are connected to this present day. Their G is the same as our sort of G. You do realize, of course, there's a soft G and a hard G. Think through that. Where did we get our hard G's from? Where did we get our soft G's from? Well, in ancient Hebrew, we have before 600 BC, Greek and Phoenician G are all connected to each other. And surprise, surprise, you watch the connection to ancient Egyptian. But let's get the dots all in a straight line here. I grew up learning that in state school. It was real history of the world. We all knew the Aborigines invented the boomerangs, but the reality is anything but that. Boomerangs worldwide, look at them. Holland, Scandinavia, Denmark, all the way down to Greece, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Africa, down to Australia. So we were lied to. It may have been a popular belief amongst the educational heads, but it turns out to not be true. But it's now believed by many Aborigines. But look, you travel around the world and you find you even see them. Well, the first time I came across this, I was exposed. Why aren't we going anywhere, Craig?
Oh, that's putting their names.
Oh, they're putting the names up, right. You find them from Poland all the way through Germany, down through Australia and in the USA, etc. This one here is rather notorious. Sometimes the Indians made their sort of returning stick, which was out of metal, and the British banned it when they ruled India because it was such a good killing stick when you threw it. Curved stick, behaved like a boomerang if you threw it the right way, but better still, it would take your head off. Now you get to Australia. Now, do you see the one with a bend in it on the left-hand side? What's interesting, of course, is that is an Aboriginal killing stick. The others are the ordinary boomerangs that you find. USA, Arizona, ordinary boomerang for hunting rabbits. By the time you get to Poland, you've got that very fancy boomerang, which is probably ceremonial more than anything. Look, it's been featured in Nature, widely known. In Egyptian, you have this ceremonial wand boomerang. So this shape and the practice of it is well known. Look at the illustration from one of the pyramids on the bottom left-hand side. There's a man with a curved stick. On the right, a man with a curved stick. And we discovered that they were throwing them because they were using them to catch ducks. That's what Aborigines use them for. Boomerangs are really good for sending the ducks where you want them to go. Even if they just curve around over the top of the duck, they'll come back and they will push the ducks down into a net. So when you look at the different shapes, you will find these shapes all behaved as boomerangs and they all functioned as hunting equipment, even if they didn't hit anything. Now, that's a fabulous collection of boomerangs. No, John Mackay doesn't own that, but he's certainly got a lot of them at the moment, including a very rare Sudanese boomerang and all sorts of shapes. Well, it's not just the curved boomerang that actually comes back. Some of them are spectacular arrangements of aerodynamics. But you see the guy there? He's got his curved snake-like stick and he's throwing it to catch birds. Now, that's what the Australian Aborigines often use their curved boomerangs for. And here we are back in Tutankhamun's tomb. Yep, I got that picture because I paid a fortune to the British Naturalist Museum to get permission to actually film all the things that were found in Tutankhamun's coffin. He included boomerangs, ones that were curved, ones that were throwing sticks, ones that were weapons. In fact, you even see them on the sides of some of the the temple-like illustrations. There's a group of soldiers. Let's have a look close up. Do you see his curved throwing stick? A killing stick, just like the Aborigines had, just like many groups around the world had. You even had books on this stuff written. No, I won't even bother translating it, but this is just to show you that you've got that group of soldiers. It's in the museum. It's a relief of Egyptian soldiers and Nubian or black mercenaries, all of which takes us back to ancient Egypt. Gimel? No, we used to think it might have meant camel, but in reality, it's not a camel's neck at all. The actual experts have said this is a pictorial symbol of a throwing stick facing left. Yep, you don't believe me? There's Joe's books again. Here's some close-up. There's a symbol on the right-hand side. Boomerang, throwing, foreign nations, all sorts of combinations there. Boomerang. So the experts didn't say this was just a stick. They didn't say it was a camel's neck, like is popular out there. They said this is a boomerang, a throwing stick. And when you look at the Paleo-Hebrew, yep, Paleo just means old. You look at the oldest Egyptian, the oldest Hebrew alphabets. Look at the one, you see, remember to read from the right side to the left, third one over, and you read that way. Now, I'll be honest, nobody knows why some societies read from right to left and others read from left to right. And you got the Chinese who read from top to bottom. Now, it's a bit of a mystery that if you solve the answer, you'll become world famous. But when you look at the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, there's Gimel. There's Gimel. Now, it turns out not to be a camel, not to be a camel's head or a neck, but it's the actual symbol that Moses has brought from Egypt of their throwing stick. You see, he was learned in all the ways of the Egyptians. And then for some obstreperous reasons, the Greeks borrow it, but they turn it the other way. Now, again, remember, we do not know why they did this, but the combination or the coincidence is too great. They have simply taken A, B, G, alpha, beta, gamma, from the Egyptian when Moses had it. But they didn't get it straight from the Egyptian. They took it from the Hebrew. And if you're interested in a few things, the Hebrews had more letters than the Greeks could use for all their alphabet. So they had a few left over. And you know those leftover ones as vowels, A, E, I, O, U. That's what the Greeks did with them. That's how you end up with vowels. The Hebrews had vowels, but they never showed them with letters. Now look at the connection. Gimel on the left-hand side, Gimel on the right-hand side. There is no doubt about it that Moses was an educated man. Moses led the people of Israel. Moses had the 10 Commandments that were written by God. Whether they were written using Egyptian symbols or not, we won't know because Moses broke all 10 Commandments in one day. And then he had to rewrite another lot. Now, the old claim is the Greeks borrowed from the Hebrews, who borrowed from the Phoenicians. Now, can I drop some very heavy hints? You need to get rid of that. The view is now being abandoned, though there's those people out there who'd like to push it up. No, it's not Phoenicians who invented the alphabets, although I often wondered how Noah communicated with his sons when they moved away from wherever they were. How did the people of Babel communicate? We probably may never know, but the one thing is we do know how Moses communicated. Hebrews from Babel, Egyptians from Babel. Remember Peleg, the world was divided in his day? No, not a reference to continental drift, but a reference to the division of the nations. And one of those nations was the Egyptian, the Hamitic people. Ham, it gets a meaning in reverse because by the time they're in Egypt, the black people are regarded as being burnt and the name goes back as Ham, meaning dark. So be careful with the use of that one, but that's where it gets its hot meaning from. Cush is descended from Ham, and in the Egyptian terms, don't take my word for it, look it up. All Cushites who are even labeled, they are painted as black in the Egyptian tomb. Let's make up a couple of points here to finish my section off. And then Joe or Craig, you feel free to have any questions you like. And we probably need to just, you give some thought to when you want a question time, Joe. Point number one.
I think we'll have a question time after you're finished and we'll have time to wrap stuff up anyway. So
point number one, the Aussie Aboriginals, and yes, I'm willing to be totally unpopular, did not invent boomerangs. You are lying to them if you tell them that. They brought them to Australia and they are really the last people using them. And they use them pretty well, those who could still throw them. I know I've tried to use a boomerang a few times and smashed quite a few windows. Aborigines are the last people using them. Boomerang throwing stick has linguistic connections in several languages, ancient and modern. All of which gets us back to the point where Craig started, the point on the origin of the Aborigines. God made all nations from one man. That's Paul's point. He made them to live on the earth. So the Aborigines are in Australia, not just because of the Ice Age, not just because they could walk here, but because God appointed this. Now, are you willing to deal with that? There's a sovereign Godship involved in here, but he had a reason in appointing them, not because he needed Australia inhabited, not because he wanted the British to come out here and get themselves into all sorts of colonial trouble and political nightmares. He did this so that people would seek the Lord. And I always remember one of the old Aboriginals who got up at one of these, it wasn't really a healing sort of meeting with Europeans, but he said, yes, you brought measles, you brought disease, you brought death and destruction, but you brought the only freedom in the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, because we had nothing of that. You see, they'd left Babel and they'd come to Australia, and all of which was way outside the parameters of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So God made all nations from one man to live on the earth at the time and the places he appointed, so they would seek the Lord. Can I encourage you out there? That's your role. You want to be a peacekeeper, then you make sure you spread the news of Jesus Christ, the one who is the only peace on the planet. Craig, you better take me out of this. You're here today, so you can do all the hard work.
There we go.
All right, let's take that off. That's great. Yeah, we've only got about sort of 8 more minutes or so before we're going to begin to wrap stuff up, because like I said earlier, it's a slightly shorter program, and I'd had a few bits that I was going to basically add on to the end of John's, but I think you've covered most of it. This is sort of a joint project between John and I, the sort of Boomerangs to Babel type stuff. So yes, we have been very, very blessed with an enormous amount of research books that are now in our research library as part of our museum. I stole all of John's ones that he'd collected over the 30 years of creation research.
I'll come and get them back, Joe. I'll come and get them back, eh?
And we've been very blessed with a large additional, particularly one big giant donation of around 200 books pertaining to Egyptian literature and language and hieroglyphs and all sorts of stuff. So it's proven to be very useful. The other thing, of course, John, which I think we've done on creation conversations before, it might be time to do it again, but we dealt with it, but at the connection, which is that of Moses being trained in the ways of the Egyptians and what Moses would have understood as a trained Egyptian as to what a day means. Because the Egyptians,
you certainly have done that, and there's no doubt about it. They can go, if Sam were here, we'd get him to put up the link, but they can go and look up the one on Moses and day, because Moses, as trained in the linguistics, would use symbols. Now you can see sun up with a little bump over the horizon, just like we do, then height up here with light going everywhere, then sun down, and you can see Moses meant an ordinary day. And so people who say, oh, you don't know what day meant. Yes, we do, because we know what Moses was trained to mean a day means. So get rid of that argument that they could be anything. No, Moses was trained. A day is a day as we know it.
And we have a scarab beetle in our museum collection, which contains the exact right symbolism representation of a day, where you have the sun passing over into the underworld and back round again around the scarab beetle, which is the sort of the cosmos, the god of the cosmos. So we've got we've been really blessed. So to continue to.
By the way, Joe, you forgot to mention the everyday name of the scarab beetle in Australia. It's the dung beetle.
Dung beetle. We did dung beetles today as well, as it happened. But anyway, right, we've got a few questions to do. We've only got 5 minutes or so. We've got a few questions to do. Let me start with a couple of quick thank yous. We've had 2 more come through. We've had one from Doki Doki Bible Club, which has come through just now. And we have another one from Doki Doki Bible Club, which came through a little bit earlier. So thank you very much, the Doki Doki Bible Club. Right, we won't be able to get through all of these questions, but there's a few ones that are quite interesting here that we would be good to deal with. First of all, very quickly then, and quite simply, I should think, because I think we've dealt with this before, does Genesis chapter 10, verse 25 refer to Babel? In his days, that's the days of Peleg, the earth was divided.
Well, I'll just slip in one thing before we let you or Craig answer this. Somebody asked, they put AU after the Australian dollar, meaning Australian. That's because there's another country called Austria, and the AUS means the same in both cases, and we get sick and tired of our mail going to Austria. So the symbol for Austria is AUT, right? You got that straight? So please don't send anything to AUS. It can go to anywhere in Australia, but the money is related to not gold, which AU stands for, but the fact that the government used to promise to give you the weight in silver for the pound that you had on your money. So that aside, Joe, what do you got to say about that one?
Yes. Basically, I think that it makes both contextual sense as well as linguistic sense that it's referring to the days of Peleg being the days when the earth was divided on the Tower of Babel. It doesn't make geological sense that it was when the continent split up. It doesn't make sense in a historical sense either. There would be an enormous amount of repercussions if you were going to try and split up continents while people were actually alive on the continent. What you really need if you want to survive on Earth is you could do with being on an ark high above the waters with the waters cushioning it move. So I think we'd agree that the splitting of the continents is a late flood, not a post-flood occurrence. And your days that the Earth was divided on the days of Peleg, we're dealing with the people groups being split up. Genesis chapter 10, 65 to 70 people groups being split up. And that makes sense in the context of it being talking about that as well.
Joe?
Yeah, it must be specifying the time, because I wonder why they use Peleg in the scriptures there when all of his ancestors would have still been alive, from right back to Shem even. And I wonder if it just means that it occurred between the time of Peleg's birth and before the birth of his son.
Yeah.
And by the way, talking about these chronologies, you may remember I shared with you a little while ago, we had a geologist from a Muslim background who came to our museum, and the first thing they see is this big timeline of creation to the flood, to Babel, etc., like Craig showed. And the one interesting comment they made was, none of this is in the Quran. If you've read a Quran, by the way, it is so disjointed by comparison with the structure of the Bible, but that timeline is absolutely important. So don't treat it as, that's boring. It's absolutely there. So not only can we answer questions like this, but you can know when the Aborigines, you can know all of this, and it fits in God's perspective, not in humanist evolution perspective.
Yeah. Okay, let's carry on with some questions.
That geologist became a Christian a week later.
Here's an interesting comment. It's not fully on topic, but it's kind of related. But I think it's quite an interesting one. I've heard the idea that the Arabs come from Ishmael is not a biblical idea, but an Islamic one. Is this true? What evidence is there that Arabs come from Ishmael?
Got any ideas?
Maybe we have to do a bit more digging into that.
Yeah. There is a dispute out there that some people say the Arabs didn't come from Ishmael. Yeah.
I think we might dig go on, sorry.
The dispute comes, it's originating from the Muslims themselves, because the Christian traditional view about Ishmael, he's not on the good side of God. So they don't like that as a history. So do some more digging, Joe.
I will have to maybe also follow that up with John Osgood. He'll be able to give some ideas. What language did people speak before the Babel event?
We don't know.
Yeah,
we're not told. Simply.
No. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if it was some kind of Paleo Hebrew, but we just don't know. And languages change so often. You can trace linguistically the languages back to around the 70 mark, but even there, it's very difficult based on how fast languages changed. Thank you very much for another donation, Doki Doki. And I think we've already got time for one more quick question before we go. Could the deserts of the world be the result of certain sins? The ground was cursed by God, cities of the plains, etc.
Okay, there will be a factor involved in there. So I'll have my couple of minutes, Craig, then you can comment. So that God told people, particularly the people of Israel, that if they honored him, loved him, and obeyed him, he would ensure the rain would fall on their land. But if they didn't honor, obey, or love him, he would ensure drought, right? So there is obviously that factor. Now, that's very easy to apply to the Israelites. It's rather hard to apply, say, to the top of Africa, where we know that it was fairly productive when the Romans were there, and it may just be their Romans' overuse of the land, which has desertified it, right? So there is obviously human activities that can do this as well. Craig, any comments?
Well, no, not really, except that we're in a fallen world now, and it's not God's originally great creation, and so there's a lot of things from ocean currents and weather patterns and temperatures and everything that's affected post flood.
Yeah.
There's a more questions.
We're going to keep going. You might keep giving.
Yeah.
No, Doki.
And as well. Thank you. We'll be back again next week, and of course we're heading towards Christmas as well. At some point, Christmas special. We'll have Christmas and New Year. We're probably been chatting among a little bit of a ramp again to and a new season opportunity. It may very well lead on to a new day. That will make it in more in line with sort of morning time, UK time. So continue to keep out and where we'll be doing stuff. Doki Doki's come through again with another donation. Thank you very much. We appreciate it very much indeed. So anyway, we will see you next week, folks. Goodbye. God bless. Any last words, John or Craig? Well, I'll try and find it.
Yes. The photo of the Egyptian with one man having a boomerang is not distorted. It's just that you would have had far more people with spears and arrows than anyone with boomerangs. Even by those days, the limitations of the weapons were obvious. But close up, a throwing stick is very handy.
Good stuff. All right. God bless, folks. Goodbye. We will see you next time.